we've been talking about 4 patterns of change that I've called universal patterns of change related from moving from pre-mass politics to mass politics. We finished the first 2, value change and identity change. We have 2 more to discuss, elite change and centralization of power on the part of government. Before doing so, however, I thought it would be important to begin by asking an important question, and that is, how did the entire change process, when I say entire, all 4 changes, began in the Middle East? So how did change got instantiated? How did change got started? Well, to understand that phenomena, we need to understand that it probably has a lot less to do with politics than with economics. Well, how so? Once the European decided to trade with the area, when they came to the area and they began trading, they quickly realized that in order to make trade with the area much more conducive and profitable to their business activity, they have to disrupt things and the bazaars and the whole system of transaction in the area. Remember now, the traditional system was a feudal order, largely land-owning based. So that system wasn't very conducive for doing business as far as the Europeans were concerned. Therefore, the change process itself got stimulated when the Europeans, including Russians, came to this area and began to alter the indigenous economy of the region in order to suit their needs. This eventually led to some reaction from the region, and the reaction from the region was channeled in terms of the 2 changes we already talked about. Value change, if you recall, it shifted from ascriptive value to that of achievement, and it also led to identity change, changes from a parochial identity to a nationalistic identity, and very shortly a demand for independence. But notice, I still have not answered the crucial question: how did these 2 change, value change, identity change, got started? The answer to that question is this. Once the Europeans came to the Middle East, the elites, the traditional elites, began to send their children to Europe and then later on to the United States to study. These children of aristocrats of the Middle East, when they went abroad, they learned a few things from the Europeans. One of the things they learned about Europeans was the liberal values. They realized that a lot of Europeans in France and England, they have very strong respect for liberal values. Now, what is liberal values? Well, for me, really, if I were to define what liberal means, it means 2 things. The first is tolerance for individual differences. That's an important element of liberal. If you're not tolerant, you can't be liberal. And second, respect for human freedom and dignity. So by liberal values, those are the 2 things that I'm talking about: tolerance for individual differences and respect for human freedom and dignity. So if you look at it from that angle, you will see that when these children of aristocrats went to Europe, one of the things they pick up was liberal values. So with liberal values, when they came back home, one of the things they wanted to do was to make sure their country also will adopt these values. So liberal values were the engine that pushed for value change. And ultimately, it led to democracy being a highly valued belief. Democracy, remember, is a political manifestation of liberalism and liberal philosophy. That is why in the West we oftentimes say a liberal democracy. So a liberal democracy is different than just a kind of a democracy in which you have the majority vote ruling. In the case of liberal democracy, there's got to be tolerance for the minority, not the tyranny of majority, as our founding fathers very clearly mentioned in the Constitution. So one set of change, the value change, actually is being driven by liberal values that the children of the aristocrats studying in Europe brought home. The other thing they brought home was what they learned among Europeans, and that was they found out that the Europeans have this very strong attachment to their community, very strong sense of nationalism. So the second change factor was nationalism, which they learned from the Europeans, realizing Europeans have become very nationalistic, very interested in their sovereignty, very interested in their independence. And so when they returned to their homeland, they said, that's another value we like to have. And so nationalism became the engine, the driving force for identity change. Identity change, as it played out in the Middle East, led to the phenomena we talked about, mass politics. And it led to one more thing, desire for independence. They did not want to be colonized by Europeans, even though they really liked their educational system. They liked the European values, they liked their sense of nationalism, and they said, we like to have the same thing. And notice, this is the foundation. These two sets of change are the very foundation of what we call secular nationalism and liberal democracy. So, one of the paradoxes of looking at the Middle East is that the change process that got started actually laid the very foundation of liberal democracy and secular nationalism in the region. So what you have, in other words, is that the value change and identity change in the Middle East did not occur in a vacuum. Value change in the Middle East was guided by European liberal values, and the identity change in the region was guided by European notion of secular nationalism. And notice my emphasis on secular nationalism. Islam is not in the picture when you go back. A strong sense of sovereignty, respect for sovereignty. So now we have this paradoxical outcome that the children of the aristocrats in the Middle East become the first change agents. You don't normally expect the aristocrats to be the change agents, but that's exactly what happened in the Middle East. So now we have the answer to the questions that I raised. How did the change process begin actually? Well, it began by the returning educated children of aristocrat who liked these two values, liberal and nationalistic attachment. They learned it from European, they came home, and they said, for us to advance, we need to adopt this. So you can see how in many ways, Middle East started off mimicking Europe. And now you can see how things have changed, that nowadays when you hear reporters talking about Middle East, is as if they're talking about a different planet. All right, so that said, for their part, the Europeans were not really happy with what was happening. So you have at the beginning of the 20th century, you have the process of change in the Middle East being one which pretty much mimic what had occurred in Europe. The ideas of liberalism, democracy, and secular nationalism is at its root. And yet, if you look throughout the 20th century, the West policy was to oppose those very elites who started the change. So instead of favoring liberals and secular Democrats and independent governance in the Middle East, the West policy was quite the opposite. So the Westerners began to identify much more, I shouldn't say identify, began to find their fortunes with the traditional leaders, the anti-change, the non-liberal traditional leaders. So for their parts, once they saw the result of education, they preferred the traditional system, the traditional ruling classes. And in that sense, we can see that there was a real confrontation, so to speak, in the West. The moment of truth had arrived. And that was the choice between values and principles versus their interest. What would be the right policy? Should we go by our values? Should we support liberal democracy in the Middle East? Or should we instead focus on our interest only? The answer has a lot to do with the way Middle East is going to be developing after that beginning in 20th century or in the mid-20th century. In the Middle East, the West foreign policy consistently sided with our quote-unquote interest and against our values and principles. And so that is an important clue to how change in the Middle East is going to be shaped and how there will be a reaction to that policy when we decided to forsake our values and pursue our interests.